Hi, my name is Michaela Wazinski, and I'm the creator of Know You Well. It's been like 6 years since I first started working on this project, and like 4 years since it was fully complete. And I was kind of reminiscing on what it was like to work on it. We just hit like 90K views, which is amazing. And I thought it might be fun to make a little like BTS video about what it was like to make this movie, why I decided to do it. This is going to be a pretty casual video, just kind of me talking through things, showing you guys my process on a lot of things. Should be fun. So let's get into it. So right now what you're looking at is the final film in comparison with the animatic, my storyboards. And if you don't know me, I am a storyboard artist professionally. That's what I do for work. And so we'll definitely get into talking about these boards and my process and how I would do it differently. But first, we're going to kind of talk about the story and the script. My main conceit for Know You Well, I think it's kind of obvious when you watch the film, but I had just graduated college. Shocker, I know. And I was really missing the structure of school. You know, I was talking to all of my old friends who were still in school about their thesis films, and I missed being able to work on a film every year. And I was currently a PA. I was living in Los Angeles, and so I wasn't doing anything creative for my work. I was just, getting people lunches. And so I was like, it's a good time for me to start a project. Let's like I'm in school, let's make a project over the course of this next year. It took me a year and a half, but that's not too bad. So I was very fortunate to have a really wonderful time in college. Just like the film depicts, I met my 3 best friends the first day of school. And I knew very quickly that I was going to miss college when I left it. I, growing up, had always been a really quiet kid. I had only ever had a couple of friends, and I kind of just kept to myself. I found it very hard to connect with other people. And so when I went to college and I started studying something I actually cared about, filmmaking, I realized not only was I significantly more interested in, what I was actually doing at school, I was also communicating with people better because, when you are in an environment where everyone, has a common interest, films, it's very easy to talk to people suddenly because you have stuff to talk about, all else fails, what's in theaters right now. And so suddenly it was like, oh, I know how to talk to people and I know how to make friends. And it really brought me out of my shell in a way that I was not expecting to be. Like, I feel like I completely kind of changed as a person in the way I interact with the world once I got into college. So it was actually my first day working as a PA on the season 1 of The Great North, where I had the idea for the script because I didn't have very much to do that day. And I had, already kind of decided that I wanted to make a short. So I was just sitting there thinking of ideas. And since I was thinking a lot about, this transition in my life, this move to Los Angeles from Nebraska, and like how much I missed my friends and kind of the routine of college, this idea started to form in my head that very first day, which is very funny to me. And I think you can look at this story as like the story of college if you want. But for me, this is very much a film about transitions and about how friendships grow and change over time, because I was reflecting a lot on those 3 really great friendships that I had and how they were changing, how they had changed over those 4 years, how I'd gotten to know them so much better, and how I felt a little bit at the time like I was drifting apart from these people as we no longer all lived together and could see each other all the time anymore. And so that was kind of the main impetus for the film. And I especially like the 4 years of college, I did a kind of fun visual motif that helps kind of lock in the like transitions and like the passage of time, which was, the first year of school is spring, the second year is summer, the third year is fall, the fourth year is winter, and then when they graduate, it's spring again because of new possibilities and the change in big transition in life. And so I visually colored these scenes, and I'll show screenshots of like year 1, since it's spring, is all green, and then year 2, summer, is blue, year 3, fall, is red, and year 4 is desaturated, kind of to be like white. I had these specific color grades for all of the years, and that was a very fun and easy way to kind of differentiate the years, as well as like give them a different feel, hopefully give a passage of time feeling as you are watching the film. But I knew when I started writing it as well that I wanted to have these little moments, that it was just going to be like this little slice of life film that was going to be full of little moments that were specific enough to feel real, but general enough that a lot of people could relate to them. One last funny thing about like the script process was, where the title came from. I actually got the title from a Tokyo Police Club song, if you know that band. Their album Champ was like one of my favorite albums growing up. It's the first album I ever loved front to back. And there's this song on there called Big Difference that has this lyric that I'll try to insert here. And I always just thought that was a really interesting and very like astute and true observation about how relationships work. And since this movie's all about relationships, it kind of popped into my head. And for a while, I was going with the title Never Know You Well, which, is more like the lyric. But since the movie is so positive and sweet that, having this kind of negative title didn't quite fit for me. So then it eventually became Know You Well. And so once I finished up with the script, it was about 10 pages long. And I remember sending it to people and they're kind of looking at me sideways like, you really want to take, like you just graduated and you have this new job. You really want to take on a 10-minute long script where like 4 characters are in most of the shots. And, I gleefully stood there shaking my head saying yes. And I had animated like my thesis film, Protector of the Center of the Earth, which is also on my channel. That's about 10 minutes. But this felt more ambitious than that. And I knew, since I just moved out to Los Angeles and, I didn't have very much money at the time, that I was going to be the only person working on this film. I wasn't going to be able to pay anybody else to work on the film. And unlike school, people can't get grades to help me work on my projects anymore. So I was resigned that I was going to be doing everything myself. And that felt like a really big undertaking. But I was very excited to do it because the second reason I really wanted to make the film was to build out my portfolio. Since I wasn't creatively engaged at my work, but I wanted to be, I wanted to be a storyboard artist. I thought that this would be a great way to, since I have to do everything, I have to do the character designs, I have to do the backgrounds, I have to do the animation and the compositing. Like, those are great ways to build out a portfolio. And if you look at my portfolio now, you'll see like all of that design work and everything. It's not in there because I don't really do that professionally, but I learned a lot doing all of those individual steps to this level, which I'd done a lot of that stuff in college, but there's something about this film and the challenges of it that really locked everything in for me and really taught me a lot. And I'll get more into that when I talk about what pre-production looked like. So now I'm going to move on and I'm actually going to talk about these storyboards that we're looking at. And so these storyboards are really me mimicking like what I kind of thought storyboards were supposed to look like. Going to film school, not animation school, the way we mostly boarded was like one drawing per shot. Unless there's a camera move, then maybe 2 or 3. It was really just like one drawing that set up the composition and where the characters were in the blocking and everything, and nothing else. And so I had this internship my junior year and I saw like, oh, that's not how it's done. And I kind of readjusted my brain and was kind of trying to get used to the idea of storyboarding. And also, just as like a fun thing, I'd always wanted to be an animator. And then I decided my basically going into my senior year that I wanted to be a storyboard artist. So I was completely switching what I wanted to do. So I was still learning that skill set even, a year out of college, So for me, this was a great practice run. I had this little iPad. It was pretty old. It was a hand-me-down from my dad. It was so old that it was made before Apple Pencils. So like were not compatible. So I had to buy this Wacom pencil and I would just, during work when I didn't have anything to do, I boarded this whole thing on my iPad in Procreate, which I do not recommend. That's so crazy. Why did I do that? But it's what worked for me at the time because it's what I could do at work. I did all of the character designs in Procreate as well. Looking at them, this is not how I would board now. I like how loose they are, I really was working with like hey, I'm the only person working on this, so they can be as loose as I want them to be. But they were still, intelligible. Like other people could watch this and get an idea of the film, absolutely. And I appreciate that. I was kind of going for, I think, like a mix between like TV style and feature style boards. I'm not saying I succeeded, but I appreciate the effort. I spent probably most of the time storyboarding thinking about how to do the transitions because I knew I wanted all the transitions to be clever or pretty seamless, since it's like a ton of little scenes. You don't want it to constantly feel really cutty. And so a lot of the shot compositions were, for me, a little bit restricted by how I was going to transition into the scene and what I wanted and how I wanted to get there, basically, which created a really fun challenge that I had never had to do before. And, I think it's really easy when you're storyboarding to not think about scene transitions, especially like when you're working on a TV show. You're doing a sequence, someone else is doing the sequence before and after yours. You might not think even 2 seconds about how those are cutting together, and you might not even see how they cut together till, the animatic is put together and you watch it and you might realize, oh, this isn't working. So when you're doing something like this all by yourself, like, you really are forced to think about the transitions. And that was definitely the most fun and most challenging part of doing the storyboards, was the transitions. But yeah, doing these boards was very helpful practice. And then, after I made this film, I was able to take, more storyboarding classes, as well as like study the boards on the show that I was working on. And I within like 3 or 4 months after I finished this film, like I finished animating, it was all done, is when I started as a storyboard revisionist. So then, I really just started learning at work. So never give up, you can make boards like this and you can become a board artist. So, hopefully that's inspiring for someone. So between doing the script and boards, I had to design the characters. I had to have a base idea of what they were going to look like. And so I designed the characters for my shorts in the past. And so this wasn't completely foreign to me. But since I was kind of doing this with the idea of building out a portfolio, I went a lot harder on it. So, I did these full character sheets for all of the characters. I did these full turnarounds for the characters, which, like, these are not what turnarounds are supposed to look like. It's kind of the same thing as a storyboard. This was me mimicking what I thought you were supposed to do here without necessarily knowing. And that's totally fine, right? Like, if it worked for the production, it's all good. But yeah, like, this is not how you would actually do a turnaround. Like, look at the feet. That's not right. But yeah, so I did these full turnarounds. I did full expression sheets for all the characters. I had these sheets where I determined, what they looked like each of the school years. I had costume sheets. I just like done a ton of different costumes. I didn't color them. I had given a color palette to all of the characters. So I did like these rough sketches of outfits, and I would just like, I picked one for each scene, basically, and then when I went to color, I decided on the fly what color that outfit was going to be based on their color palette, which was kind of fun. And then I did these prop sheets for them as well. And the last little bit of design I did was some concept art, which, comparing the concept art to the scenes in the film, I stayed pretty faithful to my base idea of these things, which is pretty cool. They just look better, they got better in the final film. So let's move on to talking about backgrounds. If there was any part of like the design process I enjoyed the most, it was probably making the backgrounds. Surprisingly, I had never really done backgrounds to this scale before. If you look at my YouTube channel, I've got 2 other big animated shorts on there. And if you look at Negative Spaces, it's a multimedia film. So the backgrounds are all live action. I didn't have to draw anything. And then if you look at Protector of the Center of the Earth, I did the layouts for that, but my friend Rebecca Snowden, they did everything else, So the backgrounds are theirs. They were my background designer. And so I'd never done anything to this scale. So it was a big boot camp for me for perspective, because, I'd always had like a idea of how perspective had worked. I got the basic principles, but I'd never had to this extent really do perspective. I did the thing a lot of young artists do. I avoided it. I drew mostly characters. I did very basic backgrounds, that sort of thing. But doing this actually made me have to like really confront perspective. And it was a very fun challenge that I really feel like I could tangibly feel myself learning when I was doing it. And I'll dig out some stuff I drew for Protector that like just does not have great perspective. As an example, that film has like, it's all organic spaces, right? So you can get a little bit funky with things. But since this was all, man-made spaces, the perspective becomes, even more important so it doesn't look really wonky. I didn't want it to look wonky or silly. I wanted it to feel like real places. And a lot of these spaces are based on, I went to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, so they're based on actual places in Nebraska on the campus. I'll try to put up some side-to-side photos, which I think if you're from that area, like you can pretty easily spot where I'm drawing influences from. But yeah, I highly recommend if you are struggling with perspective to give yourself a workout like this. Not that you need to make a 10-minute short, but like, I don't know, make a 1-minute short or just really storyboard something with complicated backgrounds and really spend time actually drawing out the backgrounds and figuring out the perspective, because this is one part of the process where I can really tangibly say, like, this helped my career moving forward. You know, in my work as a storyboarder, I'm using perspective all the time, and this was the start of me really, you know, understanding it. So I haven't mentioned this yet, but as we're going into like talking about animating for this film, I was making this film during the pandemic. I graduated in 2019, May of 2019, and I moved out to Los Angeles in about September of 2019. So that's about when I started working on this film. And I would say it was about when I was starting backgrounds that the pandemic hit. That was a very rough time. And I think one of the few things that did get me through it was working on this film, like having a creative project to work on. You know, one of the few upsides of like working from home is like, oh, I don't have anything else to do but animate all day and work on this film all day. And that's a lot of what I did. And when I didn't have anything to do at work, I could just sit and animate, which, you know, if I want to look on the upside, was one nice thing that the pandemic gave me, I guess. But yeah, when I'm talking about animating this film, originally, like when I had the thought, I was like, I really want all of the animation to be really nuanced and interesting and like really specific to these characters. But since I was the only person working on it, and it is like a long project with a lot of characters in every shot, you know, I reached a point where, you know, you kind of have to go, okay, am I going to spend forever on every little shot, or am I going to set a schedule and just try my best to stay this schedule and animate to the best of my ability within that schedule? And I ended up doing the latter. So when you are working from a schedule like that, that's pretty intense. Like I think I animated this whole thing in like 4 to 5 months, somewhere in there. You know, I was doing at least a shot every day, oftentimes a couple of shots every day. And you have to kind of start cutting corners. You have to let some wonky stuff get through. You have to kind of look at some stuff and decide what is worth spending the extra time on, what is not. At least that's how I felt at the time. I think when you take on a project like this, there's this feeling of like, I either just have to get this done or I'm going to be working on it forever, especially as you reach like the end of animation. I feel like you start to go a little stir crazy, or at least I do. So, I mean, my advice is if you want to do a short where you're really going to be emphasizing the animation, you know, make it an attainable amount of animation so that you can really focus on every shot and really make everything sing, instead of doing something like this, which is a very like overreaching big thing that would take a very long time to do to the level that maybe you had originally wanted to do. That's one thing that maybe I would change. You know, also when you're looking at submitting to festivals, if you've never submitted to festivals before, it's easier to program shorter films. So the longer your film gets, the harder it is to program. I mean, this film's about 10 minutes, so that's not too bad. But if they're looking at a time slot, like let's say they're doing an animation block and it's like an hour long, they can either program 2 5-minute films or 1 10-minute film. You know, what are they going to do? What are they going to prioritize? So that's also a consideration when you're deciding how long you want to make a short film. I don't regret the way this looks. I still really like, for the most part, how this film is and looks and feels and everything. But I can acknowledge, you know, that I think with more time, I could do a better job. Like at this point of time in my life, I could have really fleshed out this stuff even more if you had all of the time in the world, which is not quite how it works. Okay, so I think it's finally time that we talk about the shot. And of course, by that I'm talking about the spinning shot. And, you know, after I storyboarded this and I committed to the fact that I was going to do it, I knew that it was going to be the thing that took me the longest in the film. So I remember I got started on it pretty early on, like while I was still doing character designs and stuff. Like I had an idea of what I wanted it to look like. So the way that I did the shot, I just did it the way that made sense to me. I do not think that the way I did it was smart. Like, I'm not recommending that this is a good or smart process, a good way to do this, but it's what worked and made sense to me at the time, and I achieved the goal. I certainly don't think I would do it like this again, but I'll explain to you kind of what I ended up doing. So I started with, at the time I had still had a student license of Maya on my laptop, so I started by modeling this whole cafeteria in Maya. For the basic shapes, I modeled those. For everything else, like the chairs, like the coffee maker, the tables, I just downloaded base models from the internet that I liked because I just needed the basic shapes, you know? I didn't need anything fancy. And then you can see here that I colored everything these garish, bright, distinct colors because since I just needed the shapes, like no one was ever going to see this reference video in Maya, I just needed everything to be very clear. So I made a reference video of this. I basically laid out this whole shot so that I could understand the perspective of it. And I also did a version with these Norman rigs just so I could kind of see where the characters were sitting in the space. And all of this is on ones, of course, so it's extremely tedious. But once I had this reference video, I did the whole background in Photoshop. I did all the backgrounds in Photoshop. And so I bring this video into Photoshop, and the first thing you do, of course, is just frame by frame tracing all the objects, basically, so that you have the perspective right. So, you know, you go through that, and it's tedious, but you draw everything in the frame, and you're just copying it, basically. And so then I had a version that was black and white. And, you know, both of those steps, they are time consuming, but they're not that difficult. Where the shot really gets difficult is the coloring. Like, I had this black and white version done when the film was done. It was the coloring and the texturing that took me forever, and trying to figure out how I wanted to do it. Because, you know, if you look at the backgrounds for the rest of the film, I want this shot to look like the rest of the film. And, you know, a very easy thing to do would just be to color everything like a flat color. That would be consistent, that would be easy to do and to track, but it wouldn't look like the rest of the film. You know, all the other backgrounds, they have a lot of lighting and texture and shading, and I wanted to do that in this shot as well, but the question becomes, how do you keep that consistent for every frame of this moving background? And so what I kind of ended up on was making these, basically I'm going to call them texture sheets. I just made like a very large like rectangle of texture for each object that I needed, labeled it really cleanly, and then I would bring those in. I would basically, I'd get to my first frame and I would bring those in. And using free transform, I would transform those texture squares to roughly the right shape I needed. If the shape was a little bit less organic, like it's not also a rectangle, I would use a mask to mask out parts of it. Because the great thing about a mask, you know, is that all of that data that you're hiding still exists. What I would do is I would lay in one frame exactly as it needed to look. Then I would go to the next frame. I would copy and paste everything I had just done, and then free transform and remask it to the correct shape. So, you know, I could, using the mask, erase and repaint in on those same objects to basically keep the texture pretty consistent without losing anything. So that worked really well. It was difficult, but it did work. Where it gets really difficult is the windows. The windows were actually the biggest challenge, and I was not expecting that. If I had known what a challenge it would be, I wouldn't have designed the windows the way they are. You know, they're these huge just columns with like no lines, no indicators anywhere, right? It's just a huge panel of glass. And I originally had wanted to have like trees out there, and I was thinking like when the characters passed the frame, it would change, you know, seasons or like weather outside, but that became impossible. Basically, I decided that that was not doable, and I just needed to find something that was working. And the reason they were so hard is with everything else, I had points of reference to line it up for. The windows, the bottom and the top of the windows are constantly going in and out of the shot. You know, they're not always being shown. So you don't have something to basically track the image with every single shot that you're free transforming it. So you can see this old version here where I was trying to do trees. It's just jumping all over the place, and it looks crazy, and it's super distracting. I did a more basic texture that was less, it just kind of looks like sun and like vague shapes just because it's a little bit less distracting. But I tried these windows so many times. It was so difficult. What I eventually landed on was smart objects for the windows. So I made these grids basically that I would line up. The big red bar would line up with the wooden panels on the wall next to it. And then the blue line was like the middle line. And I would basically use that to stay consistent. So I would go through with all the windows as smart objects with this texture. And then once I had laid those in for the whole shot, I then went through and replaced the smart object. If you don't know how a smart object works, you can basically click on the smart object layer and it will take you to a new menu. And then you can paste in the actual artwork that you want, and it will now be lined up the same way that grid was. And that's what I ended up on for the windows. And that took me a really long time to arrive at because I just could not figure out how to not make them wobble and freak out like crazy. And if you look really closely at them, there's definitely moments still in the shot where they're wobbly. But for me, it became a goal of just like getting it to the point where it was acceptable. So that's how I ended up actually finishing this shot. I think in another world, I probably knew Maya well enough that I could have tried to just do this all in Maya and just figured out how to texture everything to look like the film, but 3D. But, I made it actually 2D, and it was a lot of work, but it was very fun. And I learned a lot doing it. So don't recommend, but, it exists. Okay, so when it comes to compositing, basically how I made these shots is I had done compositing before, but I really wanted to make these shots look great. So I was trying a lot of new stuff that I had never really tried before. A lot of it is making the character like a 3D object that can be affected by lights. So that's the first thing. So looking at the shot, this is like the second shot in the film. I've got, 3 lights on it. So you can see here's what the shot looked like with absolutely no lights on it. This is just the animation and the background, right? Pure and simple. Then we'll go in and look at the character, and we can see that I've put a light sweep on her. But yeah, so this is what the light sweep is doing. It's creating this edge on this character. I would have loved to do like some cell shading, but like me being one person, that wasn't going to happen. So this is a pretty economical way to get some sort of difference on the character between, the lights and the light sweep. And then here I'm using an extract to actually pull down that light sweep. And then I'm using the colorama to colorize it. So then you see it here, yeah, I've got just the ambient point light, which is simulating the sunrise. And then I've got this other light, which is simulating like a street light on her face, pulling her out from the back of the frame. And then I've got this third light, which is her parents' tail headlights, pulling away from the scene, and then she leaves dejected. Let's look at another example. This is a scene from the arcade. But yeah, so I've got this ambient light, which brings them into the scene, just kind of darkens them, kind of gets them into the environment. And then I've got the point light, which is actually simulating like the game machine that they're playing at. And in it, it goes in and out like a screen would. And then it goes from blue to black as, they have the game over. And both of that I was able to just do with the point light. And then with every single character, they have 2 rims on either side of their face. So you can see like there's like a more pinky one on one side and then a more blue one on one side. That's 2 different side sweeps. So you can see here when I click into the characters, I've got several versions of them. So yeah, the base one is the actual character that you're seeing, and the 2 above it are the 2 different light sweeps. You have to have them on different layers. And so I was doing that for every single character in the scene. And another fun thing to note about this shot is that for all of the arcade stuff, I needed to put something on the arcade cabinets, and I was like, should I animate something? And that just seemed like so much extra work. And so I was like, what can I kind of do? So what I ended up doing was just taking my other films and digitizing them. The one that worked the best was Protector of the Center of the Earth. So a lot of them are just scenes from that movie kind of distressed to look different. So I kind of alluded to this before, but while I was compositing, my sound designer and composer, Ethan Grafton, was getting started and everything. Ethan was really the main other person that worked on this film. Like, I did basically all the visuals and he did basically all the sound, besides of course, our lovely voice actors. And since this was the height of the pandemic, when we went to record the voices, we had this very funny process where one of our actors owned a mic and the other 3 I ran a kit to. So Ethan put together a little kit. I picked it up. I ran it to the actors. They recorded in their house by themselves with our kit. And me and Ethan, I'm in my car outside of their apartments, and Ethan is at his home station, and we're all on a Zoom together recording. And like, there's no lines of dialogue, but I wanted a lot of efforts and a lot of little sounds just to bring these characters to life. And so that's how we recorded all of the actors. Then we have the one original song in the middle of the film, and we were going for like this kind of trashy pop. Like, we wanted a song that like you would hear on the radio and you would probably cringe at a little bit, but also you totally know all the lyrics, and sometimes you hate to admit it, but you kind of have fun singing it. So that was kind of the vibe we were going for. So that was the first thing Ethan worked on for this film, because I needed that track to animate to. So the way that ended up working was, while I was kind of doing pre-production, he wrote the music for that. Then I wrote lyrics, and then we sent that off to my friend Annie, who recorded our singer, actress, Maria Small. I sent them, and luckily this doesn't exist anywhere, I sent them an audio track of me singing it. And then they basically knew what to do from that, and from some breakdowns Ethan had made of the music, and they just recorded it, and then Ethan put it all together. So when we were talking about the score, a big inspiration for me, like the song that I gave Ethan is like, this is kind of the rough vibe that I want, was the song Bluebell by Golden Days. Really recommend to listen. It's a great song. Like when I sent the animatic out to everyone, I sent that out with like the song, and I said, just listen to this on repeat while you watch it, you know, and you'll get the vibe of what I'm going for. And he hit it, you know, like Ethan has done the sound in the score for everything I've ever worked on, basically. So he always just like hits it right out of the park. He did an amazing job. And, you know, with that, you know, we were done with the film. Basically, you know, we both cleaned up our jobs, finished everything, and bam, the film is done. And, you know, it is funny to look back on it now, all these years later. I'm really proud of this film still. You know, whenever someone says they want to see, you know, what I've made, this is the first thing I send still. I really do love this little movie, and I had such a great time working on it, and just talking about it here and making this video, you know, really made me nostalgic for how much fun this project actually was. It was challenging, it was a lot of work, it was a year and a half of my life, but gosh, I really did learn a lot, and I am very happy with the response to the film. You know, I would not really have expected it to have found so many people, and that's very touching to me, that, you know, my sweet small little slice of life movie can bring a smile to someone's face. You know, that's all I could ever want. So to everyone who's watched it, seriously, thank you so much. And if you watched all of this, thank you. I don't know why you did that. That's very nice of you. So yeah, I'm gonna sign off now. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a great year